Thank you very much indeed for a very kind introduction. Very good afternoon to everyone. I would like to extend my thanks to Pasam for the invitation and Dr. Oliva. I also want to thank the previous speaker, Dr. Gauci, and Professor Vinetti and Dr. Torre for setting the scene. And we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. And I'd like to add to Dr. Gauci's very beautiful phrase of that the doctors are very good in talking, but they don't know how to listen. What I would like to add to that is stop medicating and start communicating. So it's nice to see that, the previous speakers have really set the scene beautifully and makes my task easy. So what I really want to have this very simple conversation this afternoon with you is that to see why we really want to measure patients' quality of life and how we think it's important to us as clinicians, and also how important it is to patients, which are the center of everything we do. A phrase that also was said earlier, which I like to repeat. As clinicians, we are called upon to treat the patient and not the disease. So why should I care about patients-related outcome or quality of life? Now, the routine work that we do in the clinic, we have got a patient in front of us that we as clinicians often report as clinical epidemiology. We have one patient in front of us, and we are only, if we practice clinical medicine, we are only concerned with that one patient in front of us. When we involve epidemiology in that approach to clinical medicine, then we become interested in how the study of population relate to that one patient in front of me in the clinic. So in that relationship with that one patient,
lower the voice a bit.
Oh, lower the voice. Is that okay? I'm very sorry. Apparently, I hold this like singers. Is that okay? Is that okay?
So please, if you dare put the microphone closer and just lower the voice.
Okay.
That's all right.
Okay. This is a very new adventure for me to have the headset as well as holding a microphone. So, and when you talk about a field that you're very passionate about, you tend to become excited. So I do apologize, both to the translators as well as the audience. So also when it comes to using the quality of life and patient-reported outcome in clinical trials, in recent years, regulatory authorities have really understood that looking at the biomedical parameters that historically are presented in the dossier of drug development is no longer sufficient in making their assessment of whether they approve a drug to be used in the market or not to use. Therefore, they have realized that they have to incorporate that biomedical parameters with how the drug is perceived on a day-to-day basis by patients. So this is why, about 20 years ago, the FDA in America came out with the guidance for using quality of life in clinical trials. So that's another reason that why we should care about the measurement of quality of life. Okay. Right. So how often do we need to, and how are we going to approach the use of quality of life and patient-reported outcome in routine practice? Now, in perhaps education of medicine in particular, there is very little about the psyche of human being. And yet, on a day-to-day basis, we have to deal with the psyche of the individual to understand their behavior, to understand how having a disease means to them. As a healthy person, am I going to be able to understand having a disease as a person, what it means? Understanding that psyche of the individuals in my clinical practice on day-to-day is very important to make the decision-making a shared decision-making between the patient who is the expert on suffering from a condition and me, who am an expert in understanding about the pathology and physiology of the disease and how the drugs actually can help to alleviate the symptoms of that disease. So what you see on the slide, we could use the quality of life in a screening and monitoring the patients, and by doing that, promoting patient-centerism. I'm glad to say that the other speakers who spoke earlier, they really made it clear that it's very important that we spell the name patient with a capital P. For many years, the word patient was written with lower letters, with the small letters. Now, with the patient-centerism means that the approach is not physician-centered, it is rather patient-centered. It's the patient who guides us, what is important to them. But I don't want to paint a panacea for you. There are challenges. The biggest challenge is a change of culture. I think one of the questions that came through very much alluded on that. Those of us who are sitting here, we are the converted that we know, but the great majority of our colleagues still need to be educated about this change of culture. That treating a patient is a collaboration. And in that collaboration, there has to be a trust between the patients and the clinicians. And that trust in the relationship is very important. We also need to educate the patient, because patients are used to paternalism. Whatever you think, doctor, whatever you think is good for me. Now that approach doesn't work anymore. Because of the advent of the social media, the internet, the patients are much more informed these days than were in the past. So as clinicians, we need to change. So these challenges come in different form and shape, as you can see on the slides. The motivation on the part of the physicians and the patients are very important. Accepting what the patients believe, what is really, where they come from, what is their background. And of course, there is a set of skills that we need to use in order understanding that paradigm and the process. The practicalities are very important in forming that relationship. And of course, there are some barriers or beyond our control. So what are the solutions? Now, we, I think, have enough data to show that the systematic assessment of patients' quality of life and that information incorporated with the medical knowledge can really help in our decision making and make a decision making more rational and a decision that works for the patient. The important thing is in that process we use a standard technique. Now, a standard technique may not work for every situation, but I think we live in an age that there are many techniques developed that we can always find a suitable one. I was at a conference last week in Prague, which is the International Society of Quality of Life Research. One of the things that I said in my talk there, I said that we have been spending for the last 45 years developing methodologies, but not enough time is spent on actually translating that into practice. So the time is now that we need to have that mass education across the board for inclusion of this very important element of our practice. So there has to be a convention that we be able to translate the scores that are generated from the quality of life into a meaningful tool for decision making, both on the part of the patients as well as on the part of the clinicians. Now, more and more, all these tools that are being developed also can be done electronically. So the patients can actually complete this very structured format of telling the clinicians how they feel and the experience about a disease and the medication that they're receiving before they actually come to their consultation. And that goes straight to the patient's record, and it's right in front of the clinicians when they come for their consultation. And of course, there always the possibility of that the patient could do that when they come to the clinic on a paper and a pen version. So these are very non-exhaustive list of the benefits that the patient-reported outcome or quality of life can have in our practice. Informs clinical decision-making. It develops and improves the patient-physician communication, which is the key in developing that dialogue between the two very important parties in the process. And also it allows for us to understand the burden of the hematological disease, as one of the patients here very elegantly pointed out. And it does actually, in addition to this list, has many other applications, and in particular in the processing, the administration, the discharge of the patients, and the list just goes on and on. So why there is a need for systematic and structured approach? So I really want to start on gradually how we could actually do this. Now, I could have a patient in front of me in the clinic and ask them how do they feel. But that one sentence is not really enough for patients to tell me about their physical, psychological, social, family life, and sometimes financial. How do they actually manage with regard to going to work? Those has to be captured in a very systematic and a structured way. So what I'm about to show you is a couple of tools that actually have been developed in hematology, and really just to share with you, how it's done. And for you to see whether these techniques that are developed and is used primarily these days in clinical trials of development of new medicines, but also to see if this can also be of use and practical use in busy day-to-day clinics. So what I'd like to summarize before we move into sharing a couple of examples with you, and I want to read this because this is a very important statement for us to move forward. Using patient-reported outcome measures in routine clinical care identifies problems, enhances patient-clinicians communication, as well as communications with and among family members, which in turn improves shared treatment decision-making and outcomes. What I like to also add to this is that the systematic and a structured approach to measuring patients' quality of life and incorporating that into decision-making, it actually improves compliance with treatment. What that means is that some of the complications that could arise as a result of the non-compliance and non-adherence to medication, that shared decision-making that we develop as a result of the systematic use of quality of life in practice can in reality improve compliance and adherence to treatment. So the first example that I'd like to share with you is the Qual-E, which is developed by the Queen of the Quality of Life in Italy. It's a very simple and straightforward measurement. But what is important about this measure is that it's developed with patients, for patients. It was also first developed in Italian language in Italy, which is now being translated to many, many languages, and it's been used in many clinical trials across the world, and also it's been used in clinical practice, including China. It has got 6 different domains, which touches on physical, emotional, and family, and all the different daily activities that one would pursue. And also it generates a score in 3 different categories, 1 as a total and 2 dimensions. And these are some of the dimensions that you can see on these slides, which is fairly comprehensive in terms of encapsulating the totality of one's activity, both physical and psychosocial. This also is an elaboration on the structure of the Qual-E, which is specific for MDS. And this is probably the most widely used technique for MDS. That also shows the other aspect of the Qual-E, other dimensions or categories, and how they are scored, and how they're presented on the actual questionnaire. I'm sorry, I'm going. Okay. So that was one example, Qual-E, which is specific for MDS. And of course, you know, the advantage that we have here, if there are any more questions about particularly Qual-E, I'm sure that Dr. Relivo would be happy to answer. Now, the second example that I'd like to share with you is a technique, which is a general technique. It can be used for all hematological malignancy. And this is the only measure that has been developed that incorporates and is relevant to all the hematological malignancies, which we developed as part of the activities of the European Hematology Association. Within the European Hematology Association, there is a scientific working group for quality of life and symptoms. As a scientific working group, they all, every several years, they have to propose a project to the boards of the organization, and once it's approved, then they have to implement that project. And myself and Dr. Oliva and a few others who were part of the scientific working group proposed development of this measure, and I'll tell you how it all came about. And therefore, we spent 5 years to develop this particular technique that I'm about to share with you. Before we embarked upon developing this technique, which I'm going to tell you how we did it, we did a systematic review, which is a standard way of when you want to develop a quality of life technique or tool. When we did the systematic review, it told us these items, both in terms of quality of life on the left and the symptoms on the right-hand side of the slide, that was reported in the literature by patients suffering from different hematological conditions. But without boring you with the detail, part of the development or the foundation is from these type of information, you have to develop what is referred to a hypothesized conceptual framework. In other words, you predefine what is that you want to do, and then once you do it, to see how much it actually matches what you have already hypothesized that you will be doing. So this was very important to develop that hypothesized conceptual framework. But then what was important as part of this conceptualization was from the very start, we had to involve patient as part of the research team, which is what I refer to as patient research partners. Patients were involved in all those different categories that you see on the slides. They were as subject who we collected information from. They were involved as an information provider. We also had a patient advisory group, which were about 10 members in the advisory group. We also had patients who were reviewing the protocol, and also we had the research partner. The patient research partner were equal like any other researchers on the team, and they were involved from the very planning and development of the protocol and conceptualization of the development of this tool. And also they were driving force. In other words, if you wanted to get a grant, they were part of the grant application. So you can see that developing a tool like this, as the same way as that the Qual-E was produced, you have to involve patients because you're developing something that is going to be used by patients. It's supposed to help patients to give that information, using that systematic approach to the clinicians, so the clinician understand exactly how it's perceived, both the disease and the treatment. So how can you do that if this foundation of everything coming directly from the patient is not there? So you have to develop it with patient, for patients. Now, in this process, of course, you have to again educate the research partners as well as the patient research partners, because again, it's a new culture. So patient engagement in research is a very important element, especially in the development of the quality of life tools. So this is a complete structure of the 5 years program that was used for developing this new tool for the hematological malignancy. Sorry? Okay, I'll wrap up quickly. So this is an important slide for especially those who are not involved and not aware and familiar with the development of these measures. The reason that these type of measurement, if it's done in this way that is on the slide, the precision of these tools can be just as good as some of the clinical biomedical parameters. So the important part of it, that the qualitative base, is that we, as you can see on the slide, involved 129 patients suffering from 10 different hematological malignancy to tell us what is really important to them. And you can't imagine, there are pages and hours of interviews with the patient. There was so much wealth of information, and from that, we developed the items within the measure. Of course, in order to make sure that the scores that we generate is valid, you have to take it through many steps of mathematical modeling, but always you have to bear in mind to resolve the tension between what the patients have told you and what the mathematical modeling is telling you. I mean, I could spend probably the whole day on that one slide to talk to you about. And these are, the hematological malignancy on the right-hand side of the slide that you see, and the number of centers that we use in the United Kingdom to generate that. And these are, if you look at these, you see that these items that we found out, it exactly matches that initial list of items that I showed you that we found from the literature. So our hypothesized conceptual framework was confirmed by the actual conceptual framework that we developed from these items. I'm going to move, I'm running out of time, and hopefully, let me get to the... So these are the items within the measure, the domains or the categories. And the important part of this also, the part A is the quality of life or impact, and part B is looking at the symptoms. So it's a composite measure of both, which is also very unique in terms of the measurement techniques that are available in hematology. Now, one of the important things is that for the structure, we also ask the patients, how do they prefer the recall period would be? Is it for today, a week ago, a month ago, both for the quality of life and symptoms? And we were directed what the patients told us, what they would prefer. Okay. So in terms of the use of this measure in clinical practice, we have a scoring system that the clinician can actually use and decide the number of change of a score, what it means in clinical terms, to aid them in their clinical decision-making. So in summary, the benefits of the systematic structured measurement of patient-reported outcomes weigh the challenges that I presented to you earlier. The patient hematological malignancy have numerous health-related quality of life issues and symptoms. At the HM-Pro process, the measure that we have developed has a strong validity, and it is very robust to be used both in routine clinical practice as well as in clinical trials. And I'd like to leave you with that statement and leave you to read that. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.